Now I'd like to introduce to you L.J. Malone, who will lead us in prayer, introduce Ilia, and then we will get going. Thank you very much. Watch out for that wire there. You walk that direction.
All right. So I invite you to close your eyes. Take a big, deep breath. And listen as I pray. We adore you, O Christ, and we bless you, because by your holy cross you have redeemed the world. Amen. Simple prayer from... Oh, she just went out for a minute. Well, that's okay. I'll stall. That's a simple prayer that is inspired by Ilia because she's a Franciscan sister, and it's a prayer from the Franciscan tradition. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Sister Ilia Delio. She has been a teacher of mine since 2007 or maybe earlier. I took 2 classes with her, 2 unforgettable classes. One was an independent study that she and I did, just the 2 of us, on Meister Eckhart. My favorite class, bar none, that I've ever taken. Mainly because I got to spend some time with her, and I also got to study the fantastic mystic Meister Eckhart. She's also been blowing up in terms of popularity. She's been doing conferences with Father Richard Rohr out at the Center for Action and Contemplation. I know at one point, didn't you give a retreat to the Trappist, to Father Thomas Keating's monastery? And she's not written 4 books, she's written 18 books. So we have 4 of those 18. But above all that, she's a wonderful lady, she's a holy woman, and she's a dear friend. Sister Ilia Delio, please welcome her with me.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Just want to make sure. My luck these days is not the best, so I want to make sure I'm upright. If you're wondering why I have this fancy cane and footrest, I just had a bike accident 2 days ago. So it's actually blends in nicely with the talk on slowing down, and mindfulness. Yes, I want to walk the talk, so to speak. So to speak. Well, my topic for today is the inner universe, but I think I want to take us through a wider understanding of what this inner universe means in terms of the outer universe. And the reason is because sometimes we can be so focused on prayer as something that is so deeply personal, individual, we can forget that our lives are active agents in the world. We shape what the world is becoming. And I look at the world, of recent events, the events in Charlottesville, the terrible hatred that has filled in our country, the violence. We look at the recent storms and the tornadoes, and this is Hurricane Harvey from Houston, and the tragedies that are resulting from these intense natural disasters. A few years ago, Pope Francis issued an encyclical called Laudato Si. And in that encyclical, he wanted to alert us to the fact that global warming is increasing. And it's simply our lifestyles are such that we're really contributing to an excess of carbons in the atmosphere that simply cannot, the Earth cannot handle. And so we know that, the North Pole, the Arctic Circle is melting, that the weather patterns are shifting, it's getting hotter, and all sorts of things like this. And we also know that our ecological footprint, in other words, the amount of space and resources we need for our daily lifestyles is actually 23% larger than what the Earth can handle. So we have sort of right now an unsustainable life pattern. This is a number of years ago, scientists said, if everyone lived like an American, it would take about 6 planets. So, I think we need to call to mind that who we are, what we're becoming, is impacting the entire planet. Now, I say that because, a lot of Christian spirituality grew up in an entirely different age, an entirely different cosmos, an entirely different understanding of the world. Certainly the greats of our tradition, and here I would include Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas, Meister Eckhart, they lived in a world that was sort of like this. It was a static, fixed universe, and therefore the notion of spirituality in this universe really encompassed a beingness in the world where the soul could expand. I mean, you would go outside in their cosmos, the static, fixed cosmos, and you would see the heavens above. And therefore, the Christian world had a place for both the physical and the spiritual realms. And I think that's the important part to keep in mind here. In other words, there was a place for a body and a place for a soul. And that place for the soul had a place in the whole cosmos. And so we developed a spirituality, from the Middle Ages onward, where there was this idea that God is above, God is watching over, God is transcendent, and there was this kind of lifting up from earth to heaven. As I gazed upon the stars, when I look at the moon and the heavens and the stars which you have arranged, O God, who are you and who am I? Is that God tuning in? Okay. So, this kind of lifting up from earth to heaven, we see this in the National Cathedral right down the street, right? This kind of Gothic architecture was actually mimicked the type of spirituality of its age, that you would, in a sense, walk into a Gothic cathedral, and the very, very high ceilings would draw your attention upward. And that's because light pours in from above and lifts us up into the divine life. And that kind of ladder of ascent was very typical of spirituality, right from the 13th century into, really into the 20th century, I could say. But here's the thing, it is that modern science sort of crept in a way that simply we have always been observers of the cosmos, right? We love to observe, we love to discover, it's what we do as humans. We are discoverers. And as we began to discover the natural world, this world of space, we began to realize that we could measure, the movement of planets. We could begin to measure, how the distance between the stars and the planets. And therefore, first thing we began to realize is, this doesn't look like a static, fixed planet Earth. It looks like we're moving. And the doctrine of heliocentrism really was, in a sense, the advent of modern science. It's the first time, you might say, science began to use measurement, mathematics, to begin to discern that we don't need religion all the time to answer questions in nature. So as science began to develop on its own, we began to see that God was pushed out of the cosmos more and more, because science began to answer the questions that were in the past given over to the place of religion or theology. I think then this created for us, in terms of spirituality as well as theology, and it's very complex history here, but kind of just to shape it to where we're going in our discussion today. It was the need for certainty, right? If a world is changing, if the earth is physically moving, how can we know? It's a matter of certain knowledge. How can we know anything for certain? And so I think Descartes, who was Jesuit trained, very Catholic and slightly neurotic, basically tried to maintain a sense of Catholicism or Catholicity by taking certainty of knowledge outside the natural world and putting it in the self-thinking subject, right? So if I think and I exist, then there must be a perfect being itself, self-thinking thought, so to speak, which is being itself, which is God. So he places this kind of argument for God within the self-thinking subject. Now, this move of Descartes really left the natural world stripped of any sacred meaning, any real value. It just became what he called res extensa, just stuff, right? And you can just do with the stuff what you want. You can build on it, you can splice it up, dice it up. It's just dirt and rocks. The only place that God really lives is within, and for Descartes, it was within. And therefore, we began to see spirituality, from the 16th through the 19th centuries, begin to interiorize the interior life. And so more and more we began to see the separation between the outer world and the inner world. The inner world is where God lived. The outer world was just where we exist. Some, like Ian McGilchrist, has spoken about a divided brain. That, the brain is kind of an interesting organ. It's very malleable, it's very attuned to the environment. So as the environment changes, so too does the brain, so to speak, in what centers are really active. And what McGilchrist argues is that as we began to separate from the wider world, what we might call the cosmolization of nature, the cosmos as whole, as we began to interiorize, the brain also sort of lost its right brain function. Now, I hope no one's a neuroscientist here or, neurology, because this is really not, the most au courant in terms of neuroscience. But it does give you, in a sense, a picture of what the brain is. The right brain is involved with freedom and passion and creativity. It's the brain that's connected to the body, that's connected to the wider world. The left brain is more logic, analytical, strategy and control. And when the brain is working together, right brain and left brain, you need both, right? You need the connection with the wider world, you need to be able to analyze the data, and then you need to be able to reconnect with that wider world with how we process the data. But what McGilchrist discovered is that the right brain, as we began to detach from the natural world, the right brain began to shrink, so to speak. Shrink in the sense that we lost the connectivity with the wider world, and we became very, very attuned and adept at control, analysis, detail, logic, reason, and so we built a world based on strategy, control, and analysis. And that's our world today. It's always like, tell me what the 5 points I need to know. Tell me, exactly how we're going to do this. What's the method? So we break things down into bits, but we don't know how to connect, anymore with that wider world. So in a sense, I think, just saying that this early period from after the rise of after the high Middle Ages, and then following that, the rise of modern science, into, I would say, the late 19th, early 20th century, we became literally detached from the whole. And spirituality, even, if you were to talk about contemplation and you were to look at the history of contemplation, even the texts themselves, they move from, the medieval sense of God, the vestiges of God in the world, to this sense of, deep interior soul language. And so we're kind of lost in space, I kind of like this thing, because you see, that's where we are, that little guy, falling off there. Not knowing where we're going, not knowing, in a sense, any more of the whole. So one of my guides for the story here is the Jesuit Teilhard de Chardin. And Teilhard, who wrote Teilhard the Jesuit, Teilhard the scientist, Teilhard who realized that Christianity and science belong together, said at one point, he said, the artificial separation between humans and cosmos is at the root of our contemporary moral confusion. This is a really interesting insight. In other words, we belong to a whole, we become, in a sense, detached from that whole, and therefore we no longer know how to act on behalf of the whole. And that brings us then a little bit to our story today, which I would begin not with the inner universe, but the outer universe. And here's, in a sense, my rationale, that unless we really know the outer universe, we will not really know the capacity of the inner universe. And so the outer universe is a very fascinating story that really begins at the turn of the 20th century. It does belong to a number of well-known scientist, but really the person I think who sort of tips us into this new cosmos is Albert Einstein, who really wasn't a scientist, who was, I think someone with a mathematical genius who had a really bum job, in a Swiss patent office. And if you have a really dull job, don't write it off too quickly. I mean, just think about light and space. You might do okay. So, what he began to realize is that, first of all, he wasn't happy with Newton's ideas of space and time. And, as Einstein was dreaming about light, and the speed of light and movement, and you could just see him, right? Like it's a really dull day. He's sitting there dreaming about light, and he's thinking, oh yeah, hey, there can't be absolute time and absolute space. Things must be moving at the... So he writes, the story is he went home to his wife and said, dear, I think I have some ideas that are going to really change things. And she said, oh, that's sweet, that's really good, Al. So he said, I need to go to my room, because Albert, he was a real contemplative, truthfully. A lot of science, by the way, the best of science is born out of contemplation. So he goes to his room, and he's there, he plays piano, and he's thinking, and then he comes back down with like a single page of all mathematical formulas, function, function, function. And he says, dear, this is it. This is going to change everything we know about space and time. And she said, that's great, dear. What do you want for breakfast? So what he realized is that there's no such thing as absolute space and absolute time. That space-time is part of a continuum, and that it's not even flat, it's curved, and it's curved by the mass or the gravity or the mass within it. So gravity structures space. Space is something that's unfolding. Scientists today are still grappling with what exactly is space. If it's not a container, then what is it? Is it the relationship between particles? So, this is where science begins to get more mystical than scientific, or as mystical. But what we do know is that it's a very old universe, that it has a beginning about 13.8 billion years old. And as I often say, if you're feeling old, just think of the universe. It has a very strange beginning. The universe is not like Legos, just parts put together. The universe is more like bazooka bubble gum or Gumby. It has a stretchy quality to it. It's dynamic. Time takes long periods of time for things to happen, right? So, 1 billion years for galaxies, millions of years for stars to form. And I guess, what we do realize now is that this universe, not only is it dynamic, it's very integrally relational, and it just is expanding. And we don't know how far it will expand. Will it eventually reach a point where it will begin to contract, or will it just expand infinitely? So these 3 points they're really important to keep in mind: dynamism, relationality, and being unfinished. Because the points of the outer universe will relate to the points of the inner universe. Again, the expansion of the universe, it might just go on forever, which really does then make us wonder, what are we about here? I mean, our lives are really, really short in this vast, vast universe. 80 if you're strong, Well, actually, the psalmist said 70 if you're strong, right? 80 if you get stronger. 90 with good drugs, and if you're a transhumanism, you might go to 150. So we're a blink of an eye, which has led some scientists to say, are our lives just meaningless blips in the universe, or do we have real value in this unfolding cosmic story? We know ourselves expanding because we ourselves can expand with the universe. What we do know, however, that's the big picture in a real quick blip. On the micro level, what we call matter, has become very strange. What we thought were just solid particles, made up of atoms. Now we realize it's a world of energy. Energy is an operative, it's a key word. Again, turn of the century experiments showed that even energy particles are not fully realizable. You can't exactly measure them because they have a very strange quality about them. They can be particles and they can be waves. And somehow energy exists constantly. All matter exists constantly in this kind of fluid state, a quantum state, where it is both a wave and a particle at any one moment. And the only way it becomes collapsed into something is if it is measured. And so, for the first time, we begin to realize that, there's no pure objectivity out there. That objectivity requires subjectivity. There's something about the role of the observer in the determination of that which exists, or what we name as matter. One of the strange phenomenon that was sort of speculated on early on and then later shown to be true is called quantum entanglement. Again, Albert Einstein had real difficulties with quantum physics. His famous line, "God does not play dice." And Niels Bohr said, "Oh, Albert, yes, God does," And so they argued back and forth, but, his postdoc said to him, "Albert, I think, if it really is this field of energy and things are really integrally related, like if we take two particles that have interacted and we split them apart and we place like one particle here, in DC and the other particle on the moon, then if we turn this particle 180 degrees up, we can anticipate that the particle on the moon will turn 180 degrees down, reciprocally, interacting at vast distances." Albert said, 9, are you kidding? Seriously. And that was shown to be true later on by John Bell, that we call this quantum entanglement or non-local action at a distance. It not only just affects the state, it actually produces the state of that which is part of. So the first thing, again, what we're beginning to realize from the world of matter is the deep interconnectivity, of the material universe itself. I often talk about quantum entanglement in terms of consciousness because, oftentimes we can be thinking about someone. And what we're beginning maybe to realize more is that consciousness is part of a field of activity. And so, you're thinking about someone like, I used to work with this person named Pat. And one day I'm thinking about Pat, I'm saying, I wonder how she's doing. And within half an hour, there was an email from Pat. And we used to say, oh, this is such a coincidence. I was just thinking about you, Now we know we are quantumly entangled with one another. So it really does make a difference who you interact with. You are with them forever, really. This term nature, we're beginning to realize that what nature is not so much material substances, but these deeply entangled fields of energy. Fields within fields within fields. So this idea of the nature of the universe as undivided wholeness. I take evolution in a very simple way without getting biologically involved, as lawful nature at play. There's a spontaneity in nature as well as a lawfulness in nature. So we humans, because I like to put our story within a context, if we look at this evolutionary story, beginning with the Big Bang, we look at it in terms of an encyclopedia of 30 volumes. The first volume is the Big Bang. And then, you go all the way down to volume 30, where the dinosaurs go extinct on page 385 out of 450 pages, which means this is our volume, volume 30, which means the dinosaurs are really not that too distant from us. I know a few dinosaurs, but... Volume 30, page 450, the last line and the last two words. Human beings, right? There we are. And no period, right? Right? The story's going. The story's continuing. So we are not just simply like, outflows of evolution. We are evolution. And that's something we have yet to get our heads around. We are not just simply in evolution. We are, in a sense, the whole evolutionary process now on a different level of consciousness and intelligence. So as Teilhard would say, evolution is not background to the human story. It, in a sense, is the human story. So again, that's a shift in our thinking today about how we think about things. Which means, I think, when we talk about evolution, we are saying, first of all, we are unfinished. That's what we're saying. We are not completely, fully formed, end of story beings. We are works in progress. So, we treat one another, we treat everything as if it's final. It's finalized. This is it. Do or die, in or out. And we're saying, nope, it's a work in progress. We are being created as we create, which means that in evolution, if we look at this story, life is always oriented toward the future. The future is, in a sense, our deepest reality, not the present. The present is always on the cusp of something new. And so what we do know about evolution is a movement of time, an arrow of time that's irreversible. The space-time continuum is expanding, and it's an irreversible, as far as we know from science, expansion. Life evolves, therefore, by creative power. And by creativity, we mean, in a sense, both the use of, what is prevalent in the environment, as well as, the ability, and here on the level of nature is quite interesting. What is creativity in nature itself? But nature is actually able to do new things, to come up with new tools on its own. So here we are. We humans are sitting at the arrow, as the arrow of this whole Big Bang evolutionary cosmos. Now, this is, in a sense, what Teilhard de Chardin really came to not only realize, but saw that we need to, in a sense, bring religion into this story. First of all, he says, with the human mind, we can now reflect on what we are. So we are part of evolution, but we have the ability to step apart from it and reflect on it, in a sense, to make a choice for where we're going. So we do, in a sense, hold a frontier position in evolution. But, because most of us don't think like that, I think the only people who think evolution is Google, and there is, in a sense, where technology has gained or grasped on to the reins of this evolutionary process. And, AI people, artificial intelligence will say, hey, we know where we're going, we want to take you there, right? We're going to reinvent ourselves on a whole different level of information. And this is where I find religious people a little bit in a different cosmos. We're a little bit, about a few centuries behind sometimes. And so we do need to wake up to what our outer story is. It really is essential to where we're going. Teilhard was in dialogue with the scientists of his own age, and at what point he was a friend of Julian Huxley, the brother of Aldous Huxley, who wrote 1984. And Teilhard said, evolution fundamentally is the rise of consciousness. Evolution is the rise of consciousness. And that was a very interesting insight on his part. Consciousness, we have no real understanding of what exactly consciousness is. But what we are beginning to realize more and more is just how fundamental it is to all of life, every aspect of life. To the point now where we are beginning to realize from the point of science that consciousness is not something just humans have. That consciousness, and this comes from quantum physics, where they're tracing it all the way down and they're saying, it looks like, even at the fundamental levels of the beginning of this creation, of this cosmos, there's some kind of proto-consciousness or element of consciousness. So we can say, in the beginning was consciousness. And by consciousness, it's, in a sense, that awareness in which there's a flow of information, between entities of some sort. Max Planck, who, of course, came up with the Planck's constant, said, at one point, I regard consciousness as fundamental He says, I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. So this is, in a sense, what we're beginning to understand today, that mind and matter are not separate entities, that consciousness is not only part of matter, but may be driving matter. He says we cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. So in some philosophers today are calling this the hard problem of consciousness. We can't get beyond consciousness. Even Erwin Schrödinger, who the famous Schrödinger cat, again, a quantum physics thought experiment, said, consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms, for consciousness is absolutely fundamental. It cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else. Very interesting, because consciousness is fundamental to matter. Consciousness is fundamental to, so it's fundamental to science, and it's fundamental to religion, right? Spirituality is, in a sense, the rise of consciousness. So what we are saying is that what accounts for the human mind seems to be active in the universe. It seems to be active in the whole story of the universe that, in a sense, is producing us. Now, here's where my friend Teilhard will come in, and here's where our story actually is going to pick up. Teilhard realized the fundamental need, to postulate consciousness as primary in the universe. And yet, he said, there seems to be, in everything that exists, a withinness, an inner dimension, and a withoutness. And he spoke of this in terms of two types of energies. An energy that's transcendence, in other words, an energy that moves us beyond, and an energy that draws together. So, in a sense, I brought these two ideas together and to say that the withinness, as consciousness, has another dimension, and that is love or attraction. In other words, when you're conscious of something, you are in some way moved toward it. You're attracted by it. I often think, why are people consciousness of this and not this, right? There's something about this that's drawing their attention. So these two energies are really one energy with two dimensions. It's like consciousness is moving us up, love is moving us out. So we're being drawn towards something else as we're being drawn, and as we move towards something else, we're moving beyond. So this has given rise to what, building on Teilhard's ideas, that what we call cosmos, or even life in the universe, is not just one-dimensional. Science has attended to the outer universe, the universe of what we can measure, the empirical nature of things. But there's another dimension, and that's what consciousness is telling us. There's an inner dimension to the whole realm of the universe as well. And so we can begin to speak of cosmic life and biological life as having an inner-outer dimension. The inner dimension built on consciousness, that outer dimension based on love. And this is, in a sense, what Teilhard began to realize. He spoke of evolution as the rise of withinness and withoutness. Very interesting, right? As evolutionary life, as life is proceeding from simple to more complex, he's saying that as it becomes more complex, it's developing a greater depth, a greater, in a sense, degree of consciousness as the degrees of relationship, love, are increasing. So this kind of rise of withinness and withoutness he saw as constituting the whole. Why is this important for us? Well, first of all, what Teilhard, in a sense, points to is that cosmic life, and not just human life, has an ongoing emergence of interiorization or interiority, and with that, subjectivity. So that it's not like, oh, here's this cosmic, universe, and 4.2 billion years ago, here's this little Earth thing, and then, oh, here's these little humans. Oh, and by the way, they have an interior life and they're conscious and they're called subjects and persons. It's kind of whiffy. that the whole story is actually much more of a seamless emergence of life. And so what Teilhard begins to, in a sense, pick up, and here my colleague John Haught has really expounded this in his new work, The Cosmic Awakening, that religious experience is not just a human phenomenon, but seems to be part of the inside story of the universe itself. The whole universe seems to have an active self-transcendence to it. And what Teilhard is saying is that that is driven by the withinness and the withoutness of the universe. So, in his view, religion is integral to cosmological and biological life. That led him then to say this: his views on religion became much more expansive than we have yet to embrace. What Teilhard began to say is that religion and evolution belong together. We have treated evolution as a biological phenomenon, perhaps as a biological cosmic phenomenon, but as something that is some way distinct from us. And we have treated religion that's peculiar to us. And he's saying no. Religion is, in a sense, the depth dimension of all cosmic life. And he says, therefore, they are destined to form one single continuous organism in which their respective lives prolong, are dependent on, and complete one another. I think that I would just like to underline that last part, complete one another. Now, Teilhard, again, he was an incredible thinker and extremely insightful. I would say prophetic and mystic in his own right. He, again, looked at what this physical universe is about, and he said, there is an unyielding force of attraction throughout all cosmic life. And he spoke, therefore, of love as that basic force of attraction. Now, in some ways, this is sort of like taking the Platonic notion of the good and, bringing that into cosmology and saying that, what reality is, in a sense, the rise of the good, the rise of love. So what he's saying is that all of life is attractive, it keeps attracting, it forms unions, and something new and more complex emerges, and with that emergence, there's a depth of consciousness, a rise in consciousness. So he says the force of love energy is present from the Big Bang onwards, though indistinguishable from molecular forces. Now, I have not seen too many scientists pick up yet on love energy as a molecular force, but I think what he was onto is that we need a new understanding of what constitutes being itself. And in Teilhard's view, just to sum this slide up quickly, he's saying that if love is the fundamental basis of everything that exists, that means union, relationality, is the primary constituent of being itself. So it's not being and then union, like I exist and then, and then I love. I exist and then I am in relationship. He's saying, no, it's first relationship. I flow out of relationship and then I exist. So relationality gives rise to union. And he's saying the universe is thoroughly relational and in the framework of love. And that's why it led him to say that the physical structure of the universe, is love. The physical structure of all that exists is union itself, is the primacy of the good. And of course, where there's love, there's consciousness. There's nothing worse than blind love, right? Unconscious love. From a human perspective, right? When, you don't have to be a scientist, by the way, to figure this out. All you have to do is fall in love or just love, right? Because when you love, you're aware of that other in a deep personal way. You are drawn to that other. So you can see these forces of consciousness and love even in our human interaction. And as we grow in love with an other, we are more deep, we know them, we are more conscious, on a deeper level. And this, of course, led Teilhard to ask, well, what kind of God, then, is at the heart of this universe? What kind of God, who's at the heart of a universe that is dynamic and relational and unfolding in love. And so when he asks that question, who will give evolution its own God, I always say, here's my turn, I guess I would just like to kind of preface Teilhard's insights on God with Merton's insight, which he uttered, and in his experience in his own conversion. This is from the Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, where Merton wrote, "At the center of our being is a point of nothingness, which is untouched by sin and by illusion, a point of pure truth, a point or spark which belongs entirely to God, which is never at our disposal, from which God disposes of our own lives, which is inaccessible to the fantasies of our mind or the brutalities of our own will. This little point of nothingness in us, as our poverty, is the pure glory of God in us." And he goes on to say, if we could recognize that in ourselves and others, this world would be aflame. This world would be radiant. In a sense, this is what Teilhard gets at by the use of his term omega. He's saying there is a point already, there's a wholeness, there's an absolute centration within everything that exists. It's within everything, and yet, in a sense, it's not everything. It's independent of everything. It's both centering everything that exists, and yet, in a sense, it's ahead of everything. So he names that omega as God, God within, and God ahead. So what he's saying is that this whole process of evolution, as we're moving towards greater love and more consciousness, has omega at the center. That leads him to say that this universe has one deep common reality, and that's the future. The whole thing is resting on the future because God who is within is ahead. The God ahead is constantly, arriving from the future and pulling this into the future. So we're leaning on the future, and it's so funny because the future is the very thing we fear today. The very thing. We just kind of dread getting up the next morning because what do we hear? Oh God, what's the news going to be like? Is the world going to be here? Are we going to be blown up? Right? So we're so fearful because we have created for ourselves a world out of sync with nature. Teilhard, in a sense, he doesn't expound on this, but I think we can say that this omega, this God omega, is a dynamic God of love. A God of love who is personal, who is communicative, who is Trinity. And therefore, I was reading this the other day by the German theologian Jürgen Moltmann. The God, I think when we use that language God, sometimes I think we have a notion of the old Greek God, this kind of super essential monad watching over us. But the Christian God is a radically new God showing up in this notion of Trinity. Not one person, but three persons. And we can't get our heads around that. But I don't think we're supposed to. What we do know is this God of love is deeply relational. A relational God empowering a relational universe. Here we have a stained image of a neuron, a brain cell. Here's a stained NASA image of the universe. So it's pretty amazing that from the point of nature, that it deeply reflects a God of love, a God of deep relationality. Yet I think sometimes when we pray to God, our language of God sometimes connotes a God who is watching over us, a God who is sort of grandfatherly, benevolent, and yet at a distance. And yet what Teilhard is saying, no, this God is deeply within, deeply immersed in this process without being conflated with it. That would be pantheism. His notion is of what we call a cosmotheandrism. God is within, and that which within is part of God, but God is not part of nature, and nature is not part of God. It's the mystery. It's a dialectic. It's a coincidence of opposites, so to speak. Which means that we are not alone. That's the first thing we have to realize. We are not alone in our struggles, in our sufferings, in what we're becoming. Jack Hott says, we have thought too much about God from the past, like a God who just made this whole thing and then retired to Florida or something, This God is within and ahead, a God who is loving us into a new future, a God who invites us to surrender our control and our need to grasp and manipulate, and saying, I am with you always until the end of time. And so I think Meister Eckhart did get this right. God is the newest thing there is. God is the youngest thing there is. And when we are united to God, we become new again. I think nature, the natural world, flows right in to a God of love. I think the human species has fallen way out of sync with this God and with nature itself. And what we are saying, even from a more particular Christian position, that this word has entered into materiality. That, incarnation is what it means. God has taken on flesh. God has taken on and entered into the material world. And by incarnation, we can say, in a sense, this is Teilhard's words, the self of God is in the self-emptying of God. I mean, we could take on that and just sit with that, right? The self of God is in the self-emptying of God, because that's what love does. Absolute love loves absolutely. And therefore, God loves by sharing God's life with otherness. And therefore, in that sharing of life, drawing all things through love into that fullness of being. So what Teilhard realized is that God is not found opposite to matter, right? It's not that the natural world or the body, as, still we have this kind of anti-body idea, the flesh is sin, because we had a big sin thing going on for a long time, sin and guilt. Not apart from matter or independent of matter. God is found through matter. Matter matters to God. So we take hold of God in the finite. Everything. The stars, the leaves, the trees, the human person, everything that exists out of that infinite love of God and bears that infinite love within it. And so all that, that Teilhard recognized, and I might here just put a little blurb for the Franciscans, because he actually discovered Duns Scotus rather late in life, just a few years before he died. And Duns Scotus is the one who, building on previous theologians, said, hey, if God is love, then wouldn't God become incarnate out of love rather than sin? Sin makes the incarnation sort of a remedy for a defect in creation, like it was all good, then we sinned, like a rescue theology. We had to be rescued from a fallen world. But Scotus said, no, God is love, and Christ is first in God's intention to love and therefore to create. Whether or not sin ever existed, Christ would have come. And Teilhard said, voila, there it is. That's the theology of the future. That means the Franciscans, by the way. No. Okay, well, we'll just put that aside. So what Teilhard recognizes, this is a dynamic God of love in a dynamic universe. This is no stay-at-home God. This is no static universe with a static God. This is a dynamic God in a dynamic universe. So he said, God is just not created, like, oh, we're just products of creation. God is just not incarnate, oh, Jesus came. God is just not going to save us, oh, redemption. God is creating, incarnating, redeeming all along the way of evolution. That is the inside story of the universe, so to speak. So he says this is not just about Christ. Even that term Jesus Christ seems like so static. It's Christogenesis. It's a birthing of the incarnation of divine love unto its fullness into the unity of love. Now, again, we're like, really? Where does Jesus fit into this story? Jesus is the Christ. That's what we're saying, like from the very beginning, in a sense, that God had, in a sense, willed, God loved, and God willed, one into that fullness of love. God entered into that to show up as, what love looks like. This is what love looks like, so to speak, as we see in Jesus. A consciousness, an awareness of our neighbor, a relatedness that no one's left out of this love, a wholeness, in a sense that, an invitation into this embrace of God. So, what we see in Jesus, I think, is very consonant with the new cosmic story. We see in Jesus a new structure of existence, a new consciousness. Aren't you aware, that the reign of God is here, now, in your midst? So Jesus is, by the way, was Jewish, because people are wondering, was he Catholic? No, he was really Jewish. Really Jewish. But he's like a strange attractor, right? To borrow a term from chaos theory. He's a Jew, and yet he's kind of disruptive to the whole, mentality and the whole milieu of his time. But he's saying, hey, faith in God liberates us. This God is here, now, Omega. We're liberated to accept the implications of one's freedom, our freedom and responsibility. So Jesus is the new person. Now, I know, you're looking at Cyborg. What we are saying here is that we have the capacity, in a sense, what we see in Jesus is our capacity for union with divinity. We see our capacity to become something new. In fact, we are created, in a sense, for newness. Jesus, as Strange Attractor says, what we are to be about, at least, in this Christian perspective, is we are to be pulling, the world into new holes, into new patterns of love. Jesus as person, not the individual self-isolated I, like, please do not bother me, I'm having a bad day, but the person who is deeply relational, the person then who speaks to us of a new structure of existence. And I'll just focus here on the second one. Jesus did not see himself as, this is it, folks, okay? What you see, imitate, you'll be fine. A-okay, you'll go to heaven. Because that's how he thought, right? I'm going to follow Jesus, I'm going to do everything right, then I'm going to heaven. He's like, oh, no. Whoever believes in my works, he says, not only will you do the same, but you are really called to do even more. Because, in a sense, I'm sending the Spirit. You are now empowered by this breath of love. You are to, in a sense, continue and move it forward, because I'm going to the Father. And that places then a new emphasis on what we are about in this unfolding dynamic universe. Resurrection, therefore, is not only just this lifting up of our humanity in a new relationship with God, we are called to a new level of consciousness. We are called to a new level of awareness of ourself, our neighbor, and of the world. I think we're called to a new sense of what it means to belong to the cosmos, to the whole. We cannot, if we're just sort of like, oh, this is great, it's kind of interesting, I think I kind of get this. I'll have to go home and read about it and think, like, do I really want to do this or not, It's being grasped from within, right? It's sort of like we are grasped by God. We don't grasp God. And that's, I think, what resurrection is about, is yielding to this power of divine love in our midst. As one writer says, this resurrection of Jesus Christ speaks of a new future for the whole cosmos. A new future for the whole. The invasion of the present by the power of what is yet to come. And, as Thomas Merton said, we must contain all divided worlds in ourselves and transcend them in Christ. We cannot it just can't be like just a thought experiment. Just like, this is a nice idea, but please do not bother my otherwise very comfortable life. The whole point of it is to live on the edge of future. The whole of it is, in a sense, oriented towards something new that's emerging. And therefore, I think we have to realize that we are, Jesus invites us, we have been invited to be co-creators of this universe. This, by the way, is where Google comes in and says, hey, we got this story, but we have a different version of it. I think the whole, what Teilhard is saying, Christianity, he said, is not normative of religion. It's really normative of evolution. It's a synthesizing. It's the inside of the cosmos now synthesizing with the outward, that we're moving into something more whole, more unified, more cosmically personal. So, even Jesus alluded to the fact the future is our reality. New wine must be put into new wineskins. But we keep insisting that those old skins might just work. We're just going to give it one more try. So, I think, I'd just like to pause here. It's 2 o'clock, so we're going to take a little break. I know we're keeping on schedule. I'd like for us just to consider briefly, where do we see ourselves in this cosmic story? Do we think about it? Do we think about ourselves as being part of a larger whole? And if so, what is our role? And if not, why not? And then I'd like to ask, those of you in contemplative outreach, how does contemplative prayer nurture your place in the whole? And in our second talk this afternoon, we will then focus on the inner universe. Thank you.
Dark matter and dark in relation to what the gentleman just said about darkness. Those are things, this is my believing.
Yeah.
This is an interpretation of the state of evolution of the individual. As the individual continues to evolve in the manner that you are talking about right there, the more we become wise, let's put it that way, the less dark there is matter or feeling, whatever it is.
Yeah, I think darkness here is not so much the absence of light, in a sense of light and no light type thing. Again, dark energy, I think from a point of physics, it's a different understanding of things, because what that dark energy does, it prevents matter from clumping, and so it allows the universe to expand, rather than kind of the idea of the absence of light or the fullness of light. Yeah. But maybe I have to, I don't know, I'm not a cosmologist or physicist here.
We're told that the present moment is all we have, to be mindful of what's happening to us and around us. And yet you're saying that
the future is all we have.
The future is all we have. So how do we reconcile that?
Yeah, I don't draw a sharp distinction between present and future. Since in every present moment, we're constantly making decisions, or we're constantly, in a sense, naming events. And every time we make a decision, that's the unfolding of the future. So you can say that the present is always opening up to the future in every moment that we have. To bring those two things together. Yes, over here.
Thank you for taking my question. One of the things that popped into my head as you were speaking about the flow of time was a question about whether or not we need time to flow, because if all of the created bits and bobs of the universe reside in the enervating medium of the divine, then of course the divine is creating the motion. So what if time is just an artificial metric for measuring evolution?
I think there can be a truth to that. In other words, today there is a whole new explorations in time, and the question of how valuable is this dimension of time, and do we need time? It's a point of measurement of the change of things. But perhaps, certainly with regard to God, God is sort of timeless time. We say God working in time, but there's no time in God, and since there's probably no space in God, so is time, what if we were to get rid of time? Would our lives be oriented in a whole different way? It would be maybe not such a bad thing to do. At some point, maybe we need a revolution of time. And just get rid of all our measurements of time, our clocks, our iPhones, and everything that, and to see what a conscious, what a level of conscious being that exists. In the ancients, they simply looked at the sun and the way that nature, the flows of nature, in a sense, to guide themselves as to where they were in the day. Have we, in a sense, we have constructed in a world that's so parceled out in time. We have fragmented, and so our levels of consciousness are all kind of thinned out as well because of this fragmentation due to time. Yeah, so it's an interesting idea.
I don't want to get rid of time because I would have missed your lecture.
Oh, you would have missed the lecture. That's sweet, but you would have looked at the sundial or something, or the flow of people to the church. Yes, in the back.
Much of religion also around the world involves ritual
Yes.
and liturgy. Are there new things we need to think about, ritual and liturgy? What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, yeah. To say, I do. Like the beauty of the liturgy is based on a particular understanding of cosmology. Even the prayers and all. I think of the Eastern Rite liturgy in particular, only because I love the symbolism of that liturgy. The East Gate, the West Gate, the rising of the sun, the setting, the prayers that you got are east, northeast, southwest type thing. So there is something, certainly. I mean, the elements of bread and wine, the fruits of the earth, nature being, brought to God. What if we were to now just update that in terms of the universe we actually live in, and think of liturgy in terms of a dynamic unfolding liturgy? What might that look like? Now, that's not just a thought experiment. I know the Sisters of St. Joseph, I believe Lagrange, there are other communities that have experimented and continue to experiment with a more kind of a Teilhardian vision of cosmic life and liturgy. I do think, because the point of liturgy, right, is that we're sent out now. We not only worship God, but we're sent out. We're called in a sense, to become more conscious of the heart of our life, that God at the heart of our life, and we're sent out, in a sense, to empower that life in the whole. But I think when we have a disconnect between, an ancient cosmology with liturgy, we're sent out and we're like, well, have a nice day. Where'd you park? Did you park over there? So we don't have a really, I find this disconnect, and I think it's at the heart of a lot of, I think people want to be a part of a liturgical celebration, but it has to be empowering of their lives in the universe, in the whole.
You talk about, can you hear me?
There you are. Where am I looking? There you are. Oh, hi there.
You talk about consciousness and awareness. Is that the same thing as personhood and personality?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say synonymous, but not exactly the same. So consciousness here, when we talk about consciousness, we're talking about on a more fundamental level of interiority, something that even, leaves or plants could have. That, and you might say a leaf has personality, but I would say consciousness on a more higher level of complexity expressed with a sense of thought, a sense of freedom, a sense of will, I think can be shaped then into personality. Now, again, I don't want to draw too hard lines. I think of my two cats. They have consciousness and they have personality. So I think the way we are looking at things today are more in terms of emergence, the emergence of consciousness, the emergence of personhood and personality. I want to get back to personhood this afternoon because the thing is, I think we presume that as humans we're persons, but personhood connotes a type of relationality that does have, maybe this answers your question, that does have a level of conscious love, with it. It's, this love is emerging from an awareness of being part of a whole. And therefore, personhood is, in a sense, that belonging to that relational whole. Whereas an individual can be a self-existent thing, right? I'm not part of the whole. I'm just me. and I'm not necessarily related to anything. So I do think that there is a link, an emergence from individual to personhood. All right. Anything more? Yes. Oh, there you are. Hello.
Is there a place that you get to, or that you share up with us, where the reading of the Bible, when I'm particularly reading Romans right now, and Paul's very much with the whole sin and Jesus dying on the cross, how do I reconcile that with an incarnational view of Jesus' life and death? Where's that meeting point where I can go, oh, or is that just part of my contemplation and I get to that in 30 years?
I think read Colossians. I was going to say read Colossians, but yes, I mean, again, Scripture, always to take Scripture in its historical context, the community he's writing for. You have to take it, I mean, he is writing for a particular community at a particular time. There is an element, I don't want to dispense with sin entirely. Certainly, if you look around the world, it is not perfect, right? So it's not that we're dispensing with sin. There is, and I think we can read Romans in terms of Christ, when we say, in a sense, saving us from sin, or Christ as the new Adam, we are talking about a new structure of existence that overcomes that fragmentation, that disconnectedness of which sin is, that resistance to the whole. And we're saying that in Christ is that grace that makes us more whole, that love of God. So there is a way to, I think, to read Romans in light. We need new scriptural exegesis, truthfully, in light of what we now know from modern science. We need new commentaries on Scripture in light of what we now know from modern science. We don't have them yet. So I would say stick with your contemplation. That will help you along the way. Yes?
I see that as humans, we are less and less connected to the...
Oh, I forgot to repeat the questions. Go ahead.
It seems that we are disconnected from nature
Yes.
more and more as humans, and we're more attached to screens. If our humanity is reliant on being part of the connectivity of matter, what's going to happen?
So the question is, we're becoming more and more disconnected from nature and more attached to screens. What's going to happen? Well, that's actually part 2 of my talk, but that's okay. This is a lead-in. No, so, one of the things, again, science and technology have just really exploded, certainly in the 20th century, to the point where we really can't even keep up with the developments in these various areas. It's, on one hand, I find, truthfully, the development of technology in particular a rather breathless development. We're constantly keeping up with the latest developments. One thing that technology does, it's redefining what is matter. So what we thought, in the past, even if we thought it was energy, or they're redefining that in terms of information. And they're saying, well, really, if what we are is fundamentally information, then we can repackage that information into new mediums, into new forms. That biology is not necessarily our destiny. Now, I know that seems shocking, right? Because I probably need to pray at this point. But, but that is exactly, I know Maynard was asking me before about, there's a lot of conversations going on now in artificial intelligence and transhumanism. Because we are, again, I'll get to this afternoon, we're on the cusp, truthfully, of transitioning out of Homo sapiens. I think not to recognize that is not to be aware of what's taking place, both in technology and science today. That's not to alarm you. It is to say we need to wake up and get our heads around what we are and what we're becoming. And we do need to ask, well, what are we becoming? What does the role of prayer play in this? What does the role of the spiritual life play in this? We cannot keep at this kind of privatization of spirituality. Because then we are then condoning, whatever we become, we have played a part in that. Yes, one more question, then we'll take a break. I will, I'm trying to remember.
I was thinking about, Tyler often talks about consciousness of the earth, and I just wonder whether or not the internet with us is not that.
So, Teilhard lived at the dawn of the computer age, right? And he did see what the computer, he did not know the internet, but he anticipated that we could be linked in this kind of worldwide electronic network, as he called it. And what he envisioned was the next phase of evolution, not as exiting out of Homo sapiens, but deepening what we are, what he called ultra-humanity. And that ultra-humanity is then a love of the earth. It includes the planet in a new global network of electronic communication. But he did say also that the heart of that next phase of evolution toward ultra-humanity must be governed by love. It must have the spiritual dimension at the heart of it if it is to be a new wholeness. Yeah, that's the part we're missing today. Yeah. All right, we'll take a break and then we'll come back.